Growing up, I was inspired by strong women. The films I watched, the TV I saw, the books I read, it provided me with incredibly strong and powerful and interesting heroines. I had a particular affinity for an anti-hero. And while it's fair to say they might not always be really super positive role models, I loved them so much. Always identified so much more with Rebecca than the meek and miserable Mrs. De Winter. And back in Maleficent, decades before Angelina Jolie thought it was necessary to rehabilitate her. Lady Macbeth, I think she's misunderstood. She gets things done in the face of male ineptitude, and isn't that important? Elizabeth Taylor, as Cleopatra, not only instills me with a deep love of statement jewellery and an inappropriate boyfriend, but a really thoroughly can-do attitude that was dead important as well. To me, these are examples of courage and strength and character and ingenuity. These fictional and on-screen women were who I wanted to be, how I wanted to express myself, how I wanted to see the world. But my biggest heroine, the one that I loved the most, wasn't an anti-hero at all. She was a nun. The Sound of Music was the first VHS we ever had in the house. I watched it religiously, time and time and time again. Maria von Trapp's goodness, kindness, strength of will, innovative ability with some vintage fabric and a sewing machine, it inspired me. And she'd inspired a similar kind of devotion a few years earlier at the pictures. And I was introduced to her by the very strongest and most courageous woman in my life, my mum. Now, it was a conversation with my mum that gave me the idea for this talk a few weeks ago. In September last year, I was busy finishing off my thesis. It's 80,000 words on the communities of English women religious during the political and religious upheavals of the 16th century. I was worried about how I was going to verbally defend this at the mythical and dreaded sounding Viva. And I'd given my mum the last chapter to read. I thought this was the most accessible and interesting one of them all. It's about what happens to a particular convent of nuns after they've been dissolved. They go abroad, they have a horrible time, they come home and they have a horrible time again, and it's not really a spoiler, that's just what happens. When you're writing your PhD thesis, you kind of lose sight of what you're doing. I was never bored by my nuns, but at some point they'd given me all the inspiration that I could kind of take from them to write my work. The research into their lives had provided me with the material that I'd needed, and I couldn't see much further than that. But when my mum read this chapter, besides pointing out all the massive errors that were in it, and by God she did that, she articulated something else, a thought, and a kind of feeling that I'd forgotten in my own research. She said, what a courageous thing that they did, these women. And she was right. For the women of Syon Abbey, the convent that I study, their lives were hard, and they're about to get much harder. But they faced, and they had to face, challenges with an extraordinary perseverance, commitment, and sense of self. They had a history, these nuns, of being resistant and subversive, especially when their ways of life were threatened and when their sense of moral rightness was called into question. The nuns of Syon Abbey had laid face down on the floor when Anne Boleyn had come to greet them at their convent. These Brigitte Nuns were strictly #Queen Catherine of Aragon and were just having none of this Anne Boleyn nonsense. These nuns famously as well supported the nun of Kent, Elizabeth Barton. She's a young girl who gained public notoriety and an execution through a criticism of Henry VIII during the break from Rome. But no matter of sensibleness or sassiness would prevent the dissolution of the monasteries. It would leave approximately 2,000 nuns homeless by 1539. Mary I reinstated these convents during her reign, only then they were shut immediately after, only 18 months later. The Syon Abbey nuns refused to sign the oath of supremacy issued by Elizabeth I. They couldn't, in good conscience, defer to her absolute authority over that which they felt they owed to the Pope in Rome. Now, because of this, they were denied any kind of pension. They were penniless through a conscience-led decision to not defer to anybody else's authority. They weren't going to succumb to political pressure. but this meant that they could no longer practice their religious vocations at home. Now you can totally see the drama in how they have to leave for exile. There's barely 24 nuns, they're cowering together at Portsmouth docks, they're huddled around a long-serving abbess, Catherine Palmer. They're guided by only a couple of confessors. They're waiting for a boat provided by the King of Spain, Mary I's widow, King Philip, to go abroad. For many, if not for all, it's the first time they'd ever left England. The future they were facing was a particularly bleak one. The continent was being torn apart by vicious political and religious fighting of this century of Reformation. These women didn't know where they were going exactly. They didn't speak the language of where they were headed. They were indescribably poor. Male brothers of the house wrote to England, asking for aid, describing how, withstanding the fears, dangers, and manifold injuries brought upon them by heretics, the Brigitte sisters lived in great necessity and poverty. And yet they still managed to recruit about 6 of aristocratic young women from England who wanted, despite the dangers of Protestant forces and impoverishment, to fulfil their spiritual vocation. When they eventually settled in Lisbon in 1595, they'd been forced to move 8 times in 50 years. We're told that marauding Calvinist halls literally chased them out of town, and in fact it becomes so dangerous and the women become so poor that, somewhat ironically, the young nuns are sent back to England to raise charity from secret Catholic families and report those with sympathy to their monastic superiors. We have 2 sets of amazing resources that describe these trips back home. The biography of Mary Champney tells us of the horrors that some of the nuns endured. Whilst in prison, the sisters were subject to routine humiliation. They were stripped stark naked, they were made to parade up and down their cells, and Mary herself barely escapes rape at the hands of an English officer. The writer tells us that this didn't make her question her faith or her devotion. She wore these sufferings as a badge of the testimony and unity of her faith. That's why the biography was being written, to provide English Catholics with an almost Christ-like inspiration to help them bear their own sufferings under Protestant yoke. Her contemporary, Elizabeth Sanders, wrote 2 fantastic letters, and we don't have any other sources, so these are incredibly interesting letters, that describe the covert operations as she acted as a go-between for Catholic families. She too is thrown into prison numerous times, frequently for attending to refuse Protestant church services and for the covert operations that she's a part of between these recusant families. During a stint at Birdwell Prison, which she describes as a place indeed for rogues, Elizabeth is presented with authorities who use many persuasions to make me yield, promising freedom and liberty if I conform myself to them. But, she says, though it grieved her, she was prepared to suffer even worse things for the glory of God and had no remorse of conscience. But more than this strength of will, what I find most interesting about her is that she's more than happy to show a complete and healthy disregard for male authority, and she tries to subvert this whenever possible. As she's about to be sent to prison again for offences that she's recorded doing a couple of pages before, she turns on the meek and female charm. I said I desired him show me some favour, because I am but a poor woman, and I know of no such matters as they examined me of. You can basically see them winking through the page. She's just admitted to it 2 pages before. These women were a continuation of the strong, self-assured and conscience-driven nuns generations before. My mum was right. These are courageous women. The Brigitte Nuns of Syon Abbey would eventually come back to England in the 19th century. They returned to the place that they considered home, despite leaving it 3 centuries before. Their journey had ended right where it had started. And it hadn't occurred to me until my mum had mentioned it, but it was really interesting and quite special for me to see this continuation of inspiration from strong heroines in my own story. To end with a bit of an embarrassing confession. On the morning of my Viva, before the biggest exam of my life, and right at the end of my PhD journey, I listened to Climb Every Mountain from The Sound of Music, and I felt like everything was going to be all right. Thank you.